So here is the pre-quiz video for chapter 4. So we're graphing, first one's about graphing quadratic functions. And so if you'll notice, this is y equals ax squared plus c. So we're missing our b, so our b is equal to 0 here. So if I'm asked to graph this one's a little easier to graph because I can just use basically the points 1, 0, and -1 because my b is 0. If my b is not 0, like on number 2 and number 3, I'm going to have to first find the axis of symmetry, which is an equation for a line, a vertical line, so it's x equals, and it's x equals -b over 2 times our a. But here, since our b is 0, 0 divided by 2 times a is going to be 0. So our vertex is located at the x value of 0. And so then we're going to go ahead and plug in these numbers into our equation here, and for x to solve for y. So I want to plug in 0. 0 squared is 0. 0 minus 2 is -2. So our y is -2. So I'm going to graph that. So 0, -2. And so there's our vertex. Go ahead and label that vertex 0, -2. Label your axis symmetry again, which is a vertical line. So it is x equals the x value of our vertex, which is 0. And then we can graph two other points. So we can plug in 1. 1 squared is 1. 1 minus 2 is -1. And because I can use at 1, I'm at -1, I could use this axis of symmetry and fold it over. So it's this point is 1 away from that axis of symmetry, so I can go 1 on the other side, and I will have that same y value so that I can graph my parabola here. Or I could plug in -1 into the equation, I'll still get a -1 out. Okay, so what's different about 2 and 3 is we have a b this time. So our b here on this one is -12, so I'm going to take the opposite of that, so that's +12 over 2 times our a. So that's 12 again, so we get 12 over 12, it's equal to 1. So there's our axis of symmetry, x equals 1. Now I'm going to plug that into the equation right here for my x, and so I'm going to square it and then times it by 6, so I get y is equal to 6 minus 12 times 1, which is again 12. So I get y is equal to -6. So I plugged in 1, I squared it, times it by 6, and then I took -12, and I times it by 1. So I get -12, so 6 minus 12 is -6, so now I have my vertex. So this is my vertex. So I'm going to go ahead and graph number 2. To graph, so I go over 1 and down 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Label my axis of symmetry. X equals 1. Label my vertex. Oops. Label my vertex. So that is 1, -6. Now I just have to plug in a point to the right and to the left. An easy one is just plug in 1 to the right. So at 2, I'm going to plug in 2 into my equation and see what I get. So at 2, I can go ahead and make a table. 2, I'm going to plug in 2. When I plug in 2, I square that, I get 4. 4 times 6 is 24. And then minus 12 times 2 is -24. So I get 24 minus 24, and that is 0, which is really nice, right? So then at this point, 2, 0, I can fold it over that line. So I fold it over that line. And so at 0, 0, I'll also have a point, right? 0, 0. And now I can graph my parabola. Remember, it's a U-shaped, even though this kind of looks like a B. Okay, this one, our B is a little bit different, right? X equals -b over a, so our B is 1. So I take the opposite of that and divide it by 2 times our A. Our A is 1. So we have x equals -1/2. And here, when I plug it in, I have to do a little more work. I got to take -1/2 and square it, which is -1/2 times -1/2, which is 1/4. Then I want to take and add my x, which is -1/2. And then I'm going to subtract 12. That 12 doesn't look very good. It's a negative. Okay, so a quarter minus a half, that's a negative a quarter. And negative quarter minus 12 is negative 12 and a quarter. So you could change it to a decimal if you want to. So minus 12.25. And so now I'm going to graph that, which kind of looks ugly. But go ahead and do that. Oops. So if I go down, so this is number 3. So I go down and I go over a half, or negative a half. So that's like negative 1. So negative a half would be through here. Label my axis symmetry, x equals negative a half. My vertex is down 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and a quarter. Oops, somewhere. Oops. Somewhere down here. So this is negative a half, negative 12.25. Then I can plug in 0 for my x and solve, and I get negative 12. So, which is kind of nice, but still it's a little hard to graph. And then I can fold it over. So I go, so this point is actually only a half away from negative 1/2, so I need to go half on the other side, so that'd be at 1, or negative 1, and I'd also be at 12. So then those points are negative 1, negative 12. And 0, negative 12. And this one right here is my vertex. Ugh. Okay, so here's number 4. We're using this equation, and we want to figure out when it hits the ground. So that's when h is equal to 0. So we set this equation, which that negative 16 relates to feet per second, dealing with the force due to gravity. In feet per second, and this 60 relates to initial velocity, how fast it's coming out, the ball's coming out, and this 6 is our initial height, so we start at 6 feet. So I want to know what hits the ground. Well, we don't know quite how to solve these equations yet. We will in the next chapter, but what we can do is we can find that middle point, right? Because somewhere this graph is being like that. It's a parabola, so at 6 feet we start throwing it, and somewhere it's going to reach its max height, right? Some t value. It's going to reach its max height, which would be our vertex, right? So if I found my vertex, I'd kind of almost know where the middle of that is, right? So I could figure out if I take that time, I find the vertex by taking negative b, so negative 60, divide that by 2 times my a, so negative 32, and I get about 1.9. when I do that. So t is equal to 1.9. So at 1.9-ish, somewhere around there, it's going to be at its max height. I don't really care what its max height is, but I know if I double that and get 3.8, at 3.8, I'm going to be somewhere probably around 6 feet, right? Maybe a little bit smaller than that just because I rounded this 1.9, but at somewhere I'm around, at 3.8, I'm somewhere around 6. So, but if I plug in 4, at 4 I get like negative 10 or something. So if I plug in 4 back into here for my t's, I'll get something negative 10, I believe. So what's nice about using my calculators is I can literally put this in my calculator, negative 16, parenthesis, 4, parenthesis, hit the squared button, hit plus 60, parenthesis, 4, close my parenthesis, plus 6, and then I can hit enter. And that will give me my height as negative 10, right? So at about 3.8, I'm at 6, and at 4, I'm at negative 10. So what I could do is I could keep this in my calculator. If you have one of mine, you can hit the arrow back button, this little arrow back button, and it'll bring you to the end of this, end of your equation. You can move that over. You can delete that 4 and put in, 3.9. So maybe at 3.9, change all those 4s, those 2 4s to delete them, put in 3.9, hit equals, and I get negative 3.6. So somewhere it's probably about 3.8, 3.85 maybe. So somewhere in there, really close to 3.9 and 3.8, you will have you'll get a 0. And then next chapter we'll actually learn how to actually find that exact 0. So probably somewhere close to this is 3.8. Somewhere around there. We're just going to say that because that right there gives you a negative 0.16. So maybe like 3.84, something like that. But that will be good enough. Okay, B is telling you to go ahead and plug in a 3 into this equation. So if you have that in your calculator still, you can hit the arrow back button, right? You can change that 3.85 or that 4, whatever you left in there, to a 3 and see what you get when you plug that in there. So you come in there, plug in the 3, square it, times by negative 16, and you get 42. So your height is equal to 42. So at 3 seconds, you're still at somewhere right here, you're still at 42. Okay? So that's your answer to B. So let me go ahead and highlight those. So there you go. So A is about 3.85, somewhere around there, and B is 42 for your height. Okay, so here's number 5 and 6. We didn't quite do too much with this because it is pretty tough. So coming up with points here, we have 3 points, and we want to write an equation equals y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So the point of this is to find your a, b, and c using these 3 points. Well, you always want to start with the point that it's 0, negative 4. So I'm going to plug my x in as 0. So 0 squared plus b times 0. Yeah, b times 0. That's my a times my x squared, and then plus c equals my y. Well, my y is negative 4. So if I solve this, I get c is equal to negative 4. So then I can enter that in my equation for c, and now I have a new equation because I need to find a, b, and c. Well, now I have c is negative 4. So now I can use this and plug in a second point. So how about 1, 1, because that's a little easy. So 1 for my x. So when you're doing this, you're always plugging in for your x and for your y, and you're solving for a, b, or c, and then you're plugging that in, and then use another point and plugging in that x and y, and solving for the next letter. So this one, we can solve for a or b, it doesn't matter. I forgot my a here. And so we get a plus b minus 4 equals 1. So we add 4 to both sides. We get 5 is equal to a plus b. So we just solve for one of these, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to do 5 minus b is my a. So that is my a. So now I substitute that in for my a. So y equals my a. This is where it gets really complicated because it's not just a is not just one number yet. It actually has a b in it. X squared plus my b times x plus my c, negative 4. So now I'm only down to one letter. So I started out with 3, a, b, and c, found c, plugged it in. Now I found a, even though it has a b in it, it's still, I found it. And now I only have one letter, b, to solve for. So now I use my final point, which was 2, 8. So I'm going to use 2, 8 now, the last point. So 8 for my y, and 2 for my x. And now I need to simplify, so I get 4 there. I get 2b here, minus 4. And now I got to distribute that 4 to the 5 and to this b. That all equals 8. So I get 20 minus 4b plus 2b. Well, isn't that just a negative 2b? Write those two together. It's a negative 2b minus 4. Well, 20 minus 4 isn't 20 minus 4? 20 minus 4, isn't that 16? And that equals 8. So now I can move these around, right? I want to get b by itself, so I could add 2b to both sides. So I get 2b plus 8 equals 16. Now I can subtract 8. 2b, come on, 2b equals 8 divided by 2. So I get b is equal to 4. So now I have b, right? So now I have y equals my ax squared. Well, isn't a 5 minus b? So can I plug in that b right there? Plus my b times x minus my c. So now I can plug in my b, which is 4. And I get 1 for my x, so I can put it there if I wanted to. 1x squared plus 4x minus 4. So there's my equation that represents going through those 3 points. Okay, number 6, same thing. So start with this point. This point, 0, 5, is easy to start with. So I do 5 is my y. A times x squared, well, x squared is 0. Plus b times my x, which again is 0. Plus c. So again, I get c all by itself, which is nice. So c actually does equal something. So I can plug that in. So y equals ax squared plus bx plus my c, which is 5. Now I can plug in a second point. Here, maybe negative 1. Negative 1's fine. Negative 1, 1, so my y is 1 this time. My x is negative 1. Negative 1 squared is still 1. 1 times a is a. B times my x, which is negative 1, is a negative b, and then plus 5 for that c. So here I probably just want to solve for a because it's positive. So I'm going to add 4, or add b, sorry, and subtract 5 from both sides. That probably looks ugly, so we'll fix that. So I'm going to subtract 5. So 1 minus 5. And then I'll add b after that. So we'll go ahead and get negative 4 equals a minus b. We'll add b to both sides. So we get a positive b minus 4 equals our a. So again, now we know our a. Even though it has a b in it, that's okay. So it's a x squared plus b x plus our c, which is 5. Okay, so now again, now we only have one letter b. So we go ahead and plug in our third point, which is 2, 7. So we plug in that third point. 7 for my y. There's my a, b minus 4, times my x, which is 2. 2 squared is 4. 4 times b minus 4. I need to distribute that 4. So I get 4b minus 16. And then I take my b and I times by my x, which again was 2. So I get 2b. And 2b plus 4b would be 6b. And then I add my c. Ooh, I'm running out of room here. Plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5. Negative 16 plus 5, that's negative 11. So I have 6b minus 11. Ooh, that b's ugly. Ugh. My pen is not catching up with me. And that equals 7, right? This whole thing equals 7 all the way down. So now we can add 11. Add 11. So we get 18, which is nice, because 6 times what is 18? That'd be 3. So 6 is equal to b. Oh, 6. Sorry, I gave you the answer. Divide both sides by 6, and the answer is 3. So there's our b. Now we can start plugging that back in, right? Y equals, let's switch colors here. Y equals our a, which is, was it 5 minus b, or b minus 4? B minus 4, okay. B minus 4, so I can plug in my b, which is 3, so I get negative 1 for my a, x squared, plus my b times my x, so that'd be 3x, plus my c, which was 5. So there's my equation. Okay, number 7 and 8 and 9 are really all the same thing. Basically solve these all by square rooting, right? So since your b is gone, you could do by factoring, but square rooting is a lot easier because your b is gone. You just want to move your c to the other side. So then that x squared is by itself. And then how do you get rid of square? I don't know. So you get rid of squared by square rooting both sides. So x is equal to the plus or minus the square root of 121. So square root is always plus or minus because 11 times 11 is 121, and a negative 11 times a negative 11 is 121 as well. Here it's a little more complicated. First you got to add that c to this side. So you get 245. 45. So x squared is not quite by itself. So you got to get rid of the multiplying by 5 by dividing both sides by 5. So you get x squared is equal to 49, sorry. 49. Now you can square root both sides and you get x is equal to 7 and x is equal to negative 7. Now this last one might as well do the same thing on it, just to find, because it wants to do by graphing. So you could add 36 to both sides. So you get 4x squared equals positive 36. Divide by 4, divide by 4. So x squared equals 9, square root, x equals positive 3. So that means at 3, I'm at 0 here. And at negative 3, I'm also at 0. So those are your x-intercepts, your solutions. Now we can go ahead and graph the vertex. Again, my b is 0. So whenever b equals 0, my vertex is just going to be, my axis symmetry is x equals 0. X equals 0. And now I can plug that in and I get negative 36. So here when I plug that in and get negative 36, that's not fun, but maybe count by 6 is 6. So negative 6, negative 12, negative 36. So down here, so mark this because you know you're doing it something by counting by different things. So 0, negative 36, that's your vertex. And you can go ahead and graph that. And whenever you graph this, whenever it's set equal to 0 and you're asked to graph, you just change that 0 to a y. So y equals. Okay, solve by factoring. So big thing here is it needs to be set equal to 0. So only one, maybe move this one over to both sides. And you can't subtract those because that's a c squared and that's just a c. So you get c squared minus 8c equals 0. And then you can factor this. Here we don't have a c. So our CA, you could still do CAB, but you don't really have to. You can just take out the greatest common factor. So here it would be 0 equals negative 8. So what times what is 0 and negative 8? That's just a 0 and a negative 8. So we get C minus 0 or plus 0, whatever you want to say. And C minus 8. Come on. C minus 8 equals 0. So just take the opposites here because your A is 1. So since your A is 1, so this one is still going to be just C equals 0. And this is C equals 8. These other ones, they're already set equal to 0, so you're fine there. So don't worry about that. So you don't need to move anything over. So you can factor it by CAB, so you take your C times your A. So on number 10, you're taking 1 times 7. So your CA is 7 and your B is 8. So what times what is 7? Oops, sorry. What times what is 7? But adds, because your CA is positive, what adds to 8? Well, that is a positive 7 and a 1. So we have m plus 7. I'll do it the long way this time, and m plus 1 equals 0. So when I multiply two things and the answer is 0, that means this first thing equals 0, or the second thing equals 0. And you need to have both. So then just solve for m, so m equals negative 1. And subtract 7 on this one, so m equals negative 7. So you have two answers. Notice those are opposite, so that's why I just took the opposite of this. C equals 0. Opposite of negative 8 is positive 8. Same thing here. Again, you don't have an A. So if you do have an A, if your A is something other than 1, then once you get these answers, just divide by your A. So here our CA is negative 24. So that means I'm really going to subtract to my B. So what times what is 24 but subtracts to 2? Well, that's just a 6 and a 4. So 6 minus 4. And one of them needs to be negative, and 6 minus 4 is 2, and that's your middle one. So whenever you have this as negative, then whatever the sign of this one is, that's the sign of the bigger number. So we get n plus 6. times n minus 4 equals 0. So we can just take the opposites. N equals negative 6 and n equals positive 4. So there are your answers for those two. Okay, last one on your pre-quiz, explaining why either A or B must be 0 if A times B equals 0, but neither A or B must be 4 when A, B equals 4. So A or B must be 0 if this is true, right? So A times B equals 0, okay? So we're trying to explain why A or B must be 0. But neither A or B must be 4. So what we're saying is A can't be 4, and B can't be 4 when A times B equals 4. So this is pretty easy. It's basically when you multiply by 0 rule, right? When you multiply by 0, if one of them has to be 0. So when I take one of these, A or B, and I multiply, I can pick anything for A or B, but one of them has to be 0, because when I multiply by 0, my answer is always 0. But when I multiply two things and I actually get a number like 4, when it says neither A nor B is 4, meaning that A doesn't have to be 4 or B doesn't have to be 4. So I can multiply two things and the answer doesn't have to be 4, right? Because I could take A equals 2 and B equals 2 and I still get 4. So what this is trying to explain to you is that when you multiply two things and you get an answer, the only time that one of those products, one of those factors has to be 0 is if your answer is 0. Any other time, so like this, my answer is 0, or 4, sorry, A times B equals 4. And over here, A times B equals 0. So it's asking, why can't, because this is true, A times B equals 0, one of them has to be 0. Well, why doesn't one of these have to be 4, right? So one of these two has to be my answer, right? But why is it not true that my answer doesn't have to be one of these? But when I do this one over to the left, my answer is 0. Why does one of these have to be 0? Well, that's because you're multiplying by 0. Whenever you multiply by 0, you get an answer of 0. So that you probably still don't maybe get it, but, and I was probably terrible at explaining it. But the truth of the matter is, whenever you multiply by 0, your answer is 0. And that's just the fact about multiplying by 0. You get an answer by 0. If your answer is not 0, then there's lots of things that you can multiply to get to that answer. But when you multiply two things and the answer is 0, one of them is 0. That's just the way you multiply by 0.